I'm Scott Lucas. This is today's EAWorldView on Iran. At the start of this year, a prominent U.S. academic named Robert Jervis published a long piece in Foreign Affairs. He argued for a coercive diplomacy with Iran. He used quite long, fancy academic words, but in effect what he was saying was, I don't want military action to try to restrict Iran's nuclear program, but I do think something has to be done about that program. So rather than just simply have a two-way negotiation, let's back up diplomacy with coercion. In other words, tough sanctions, economic measures to make the Iranians concede or come to us before we have to engage in two-way talks. Most ideas disappear, but Jervis is important enough that his don't. And they don't because they were politically useful. For a faction within the Obama administration, and indeed for other countries like Israel, Jervis's coercive diplomacy could be used. We don't have to strike Iran's nuclear facilities, but if we keep ramping up the sanctions, sooner or later Iran will come to us and they will beg for a settlement. Sanctions indeed were increased for months up until June and the election of President Rouhani. But now we're in a different situation, supposedly. The United States is now talking with Iran and with other powers about a genuine agreement, an attempt to limit Iran's uranium enrichment in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. Those talks have started off in Geneva very positively, very usefully. There's the prospect of further, more detailed technical talks. So what happens to Jervis's coercive diplomacy then? Does it disappear? Absolutely not. Even as the talks were starting in Geneva, there was an opinion piece in the Washington Post from a one-time academic, government official, and now senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, a man named Ray Takeyh. Takeyh argued, without much evidence, that President Rouhani in Iran is a false moderate, that in fact foreign policy is being run by hardliners and shadowy figures of the Revolutionary Guards, that they are the people who in fact control Iran's nuclear diplomacy. Leave aside for the fact that Takeyh is absolutely wrong, that President Rouhani gave responsibility for the nuclear file to the Foreign Office just before the Geneva talks. It is Takeyh's conclusion that is meant to stick in your mind. Takeyh's conclusion that tells us, given the stark realities, it is time for the great powers to have a maximalist approach to diplomacy with Iran. It is too late for more Iranian half steps and half measures. Tehran must account for all its illicit nuclear activities and be compelled to make irreversible concessions that permanently degrade its ability to reconstitute its nuclear weapons program at a more convenient time. In other words, no two-way negotiation. Tehran must be compelled, must be coerced to permanently degrade its nuclear program. Not just any ability to make nuclear weapons, its entire civilian nuclear program. Forget for the moment whether or not Tehran should be coerced to do this. Ask yourself, after months of sanctions, years of sanctions, does it appear that Tehran is going to give way to coercion, that it simply is going to throw up its hands in defeat? After months, indeed years of economic downturn, of tensions caused by sanctions, is Tehran giving up? No. If Takeyh is honest, if Robert Jervis is honest, if all the other advocates of coercive diplomacy are honest, they have to address this question. Because it is unlikely that you will get a negotiated settlement with coercive diplomacy, you are saying that Tehran has to be defeated. If you're not going to use military weapons to do that, are you going to spend more and more time on more and more sanctions? And how are you going to do this for? Is this a perpetual conflict? Do you really envisage that some type of magical regime change will come in and solve this for you? Unless you can lay out a plan, an alternative negotiation by which this coercion will supposedly work and lead to something that is good for Iran and the rest of us, then you are leading us down a path which has no end, which has no resolution. And whether you are an academic or a pundit like Ray Takeyh, you need to admit that you don't see how this is going to end, and that you don't see any alternative to the talks going on in Geneva. I'm Scott Lucas. This has been EA's Worldview on Iran for today.